Most people hear the word metaphysics and immediately drift into something vague. Crystals, energy, manifestation, something soft and unprovable and completely off topic. And it's almost decorative to an extent. It gets grouped with these spiritual aesthetics rather than the actual discipline it is that should be taken seriously. And that misunderstanding has been repeated so often and so commonly that the word itself and the concept of metaphysics itself have lost the weight. Metaphysics is not decoration. It is the part of philosophy that asks the question that absolutely everything else depends on. What is reality? Exactly, that's it. That's the whole question. What exists and what only appears to exist? What is a thing and what is a self? And what is time and what is caution? What is anything? What is literally anything? Before you can talk about science or ethics or psychology or philosophy or even everyday decisions, you are already assuming answers to those questions. Metaphysics is where the assumptions are examined instead of ignored and assumed. The name itself wasn't something mystical either. It came from Aristotle, one of the most famous philosophers of all time. His works on these questions were placed after the physics, therefore metaphysica. And not because they were beyond reality, but simply because they dealt with what reality is at its most fundamental level. It is substance, it is being, it is change, it is something that you describe before it actually does anything. That is where metaphysics began. But it didn't end with him either. Metaphysics runs through almost every single major thinker who ever took existence seriously. Plato would question whether what we see is more real than what we understand. Immanuel Kant would argue that we never actually access reality directly and only through the structure of our own perception. Martin Heidegger asked what it meant to even be something and why that question was forgotten. None of this is fringe thinking. All of this is the foundation, the base of philosophy. And yet somewhere along that way, metaphysics became associated with something else completely entirely. It became associated with spiritualism, the idea that reality is shaped by completely unseen forces that you cannot control, that consciousness extends beyond the individual, that there is something deeper than the material layer within our lives that we interact with every single day. Some of that may overlap with the questions of metaphysics, some of it doesn't. The problem is when the two are collapsed into one another without any sort of distinction or direction. Metaphysics asks what is real. Spiritualism often assumes an answer to what is real. That doesn't make spiritualism meaningless. I'm not here to just rag on it and make fun of it. It means that it operates on a completely different spectrum though, however. It moves towards interpretation and it moves towards some sort of meaning and experience. Metaphysics stays at the level of structure and the level of foundation. It asks what must be true for any experience to actually occur at all. And this is where the distinction where it becomes important and clear. You don't need to believe in metaphysics for it to exist. You're already using it day to day. The moment that you say, this is real, you've made a metaphysical claim. The moment that you say this matters, you've made a metaphysical assumption. Even the idea that only physical things exist itself is a metaphysical solution or position. There is no neutral ground here. You cannot choose whether or not it exists in your mind. That's why misunderstanding metaphysics matters. That's why I'm making this video, to clear up these assumptions and clear up this misdirection. If you dismiss it as something abstract or mystical, then you end up inheriting assumptions that you never actually examined yourself. You start living inside of a model of reality that you did not choose simply because it was handed to you by culture or education or convenience. And most of the time, you never actually even notice that. You move through your life assuming that what you see is what it is, that identity is a stable foundation that can be built upon, that time moves in a straight line, that cause and effect are just simple things that you can ignore once you understand them, that you are a separate entity moving through an external world. Metaphysics interrupts that comfort, that confusion. It asks whether the assumptions are true or just useful and convenient. Once that question is open, that Pandora's box, things begin to shift. Because if your sense of self is completely constructed rather than fixed, then who you think you are becomes less and less certain over time. If time itself is not as straightforward as it feels, then your relationships in the past and the future start to change. If reality is filtered through perception, then what you call truth simply becomes something much more fragile. This is where people start calling that idea of metaphysics spiritual, and it isn't because it's inherently a mystical thing, but simply because it destabilizes that surface layer of reality that people are so used to. It removes the sense that things are as solid and obvious as they appear, and for some people that destabilization opens the door to some sort of spiritual interpretance. Ideas like non-duality, the notion that boundaries between self and world are not as rigid as they seem, that consciousness is not something that you have, but instead something that you are within. These ideas sit at that intersection between metaphysics and spirituality. But again, that difference, that distinction is so important. It matters so much because metaphysics doesn't tell you what you have to believe in. It just asks what has to be true to believe in something else. Spiritualism, however, often tells you what is meaningful. Metaphysics just asks what is real before the meaning is applied to anything. And the reason this matters isn't some academic reason. It's not so you can get higher marks. It's not so you can get a better job. It's because the way that you understand reality determines the way that you live inside of it. If you believe that the self is fixed, then you project it differently. If you believe that reality is purely a material thing, then you interpret experiences completely differently. If you believe that consciousness is fundamental, then your sense of identity will shift. You do not need to study metaphysics formally for it to affect you. It already does. That is a given fact. The only difference is whether those beliefs are conscious or inherited. Most people will never question that. They move through life operating on default settings. They move through life never asking where those settings or those beliefs came from or whether they actually make sense in their current life. Metaphysics is the act of pausing, taking a breath and looking at the system instead of just using it. And that is why it's so often misunderstood. It doesn't give away easy answers. It doesn't offer comfort to you. It doesn't simplify reality into something more manageable. If anything, it does the complete opposite. It complicates what seemed so obvious. It exposes how much of what you take for granted rests on assumptions that can be questioned. And once you start questioning them, you don't return to that same level of certainty ever. That is the real cost of metaphysics. It's not confusion, but instead it's awareness. Awareness that what you call reality is not as fixed as it feels or seems. Awareness that your experience is shaped by structures that you never designed. Awareness that the line between philosophy and spirituality is not as clean as people like to pretend, but also not as interchangeable as it's often presented to you. Metaphysics does not replace reality nor your current thinking. All it does is reveal how little of what you've actually examined based on the beliefs that you live by.